Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Carrie Eutizi. I work for the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. My email is carrie@acesdv.org should you have questions. My job is Sexual Violence Response Coordinator, and that pretty much means that I give trainings most of the time. So hopefully y'all can hear me okay. FYI, when we talk about sexual violence, it's often going to be a difficult topic to talk about. So please make sure you take care of yourself. If you have questions, they're welcome. And if I'm talking too fast, let me know. Of course, there are lots of people in this room who are experts to their own experience, so I welcome your additions, your questions, all of those things. I'm here for it. I'm going to try to monitor the chat as well as I can, but I'm sure that the hosts will also help as well. So when we talk about sexual violence, we're going to be using gender neutral language because we know that sexual violence happens to everyone. We're going to say sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual violence kind of interchangeably. The phrase victim, survivor, or person who experienced sexual violence. When I say victim, I'm usually talking about like legal stuff. When I'm saying survivor, I'm talking about a human person. So just keep that in mind. Um, Also, harm doer, person who committed harm, or the abuser, all of those things could be interchangeable. And when we talk about healing and justice, so most people don't get justice when it comes to sexual violence, but they can potentially have healing. So the sexual violence umbrella is a wide term. So we're not just talking about the word rape. That is something that is pretty commonly used. However, it also includes things like sexual coercion, sexual harassment, unwanted sexual contact, sex trafficking, being forced to penetrate someone, rape, or non-contact unwanted sexual experiences, technology misuse. Not all of these things are prosecutable on their own. However, they all do fall under the umbrella, and there are more things as well. And what I really want us to get out of this concept is that there isn't just one concept of sexual assault, that everybody's experience is their own. And when we do expand our definition, we can say that we are making sure that we're taking care of a survivor's well-being, and it's not an advocate or a doctor's role to say what was a sexual assault or not. It's our job to just make sure we take care of them. So here in the US, the statistic that we have right now is that every 68 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted. In 2023, it was estimated about 481,000 incidents of rape or sexual assault among US residents over the age of 12. Um, we do know that most sexual assaults are underreported. So this is just what's reported. Globally, nearly 1 in 3 women worldwide who've been in a relationship experience sexual violence by an intimate partner during their lifetime. Almost 30% of women, 15 to 49, report experiencing physical or sexual intimate partner violence within the last year. And in some countries and regions, forced sex by an intimate partner has been reported about 25% of women, so including Mexico, Peru, and Zimbabwe. Marginalized communities are at a much higher risk. So people who have limited access to support or healthcare, people who are experiencing social or economic exclusion, people living with disabilities, individuals who have identities other than cisgender or heterosexual, or communities with language or citizenship barriers as well. More than half of women and 1/3 of men have experienced contact sexual violence during their lifetimes. 1 in 2 transgender or gender nonconforming people have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime as well. An estimated 32% of women and 14% of men experienced contact sexual violence before they turned 18. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have experienced child sexual abuse. Up to 16% of boys came forward and disclosed when reaching adulthood. And almost 30% of girls came forward as adults. People with disabilities experience sexual assault 3 times more than people without disabilities, and people with developmental or intellectual disabilities experience sexual assault 7 times more than without people with disabilities. And sexual violence against people with disabilities is often overlooked or treated as invisible because of societal myths due to disability or sexuality. 1 in 10 people over the age of 60 experience some type of abuse each year, and seniors with disabilities are nearly twice as likely to experience elder abuse. Sexual abuse remains the least reported types of elder abuse, and this is generally because the person who's assaulting is the caregiver. And so I want to address the myth of the stranger in the bush that jumps out at someone and sexually assaults them. Most victims are actually targeted. based on vulnerability, accessibility, and credibility. So the people at the intersections of this Venn diagram are like people who are using substances, people who use medication, people who are unhoused, people who are highly sexually active or already sexually active, immigrants or undocumented people, people in foster care, people in detention settings, criminal or school records or low socioeconomic status, people who are elder, people who are children. All of those people fall in the center of this Venn diagram. And then also, there's that, again, that kind of trope that a stranger commits sexual assault. However, it is actually almost 40% committed by an acquaintance, 33% committed by a current or former spouse partner, and then 6% by a person somebody can't remember, 3% by a non-spouse relative, and then 19% by a stranger. And then for children, it's actually way less. So we teach stranger danger to children. But it's actually only 5% for children who are assaulted by strangers. 35% are family members and 60% are acquaintances. So the impact of sexual violence, immediate responses, and long-term effects. Most survivors, we think of fight or flight, but in reality, survivors actually freeze and fawn. 75% of sexual assault victims experience moderate to high levels of tonic immobility. So the inability to move, or the fawn effect of just making sure that they live through it, the whole playing possum concept. And when we're talking about neurobiology of trauma, we want to make sure that we're like considering that the brain actually shuts people down. So because they are super, super overwhelmed. Physically, sexual violence can cause chronic pain, fatigue or exhaustion, gastrointestinal disorders, migraines or frequent headaches, eating disorders, substance use or dependence. It might exacerbate previous health conditions, might cause someone to be suicidal, or they may avoid healthcare, especially considering if they don't want someone touching them in the same place that was the scene of their crime. Psychological impacts: shame and blame, irritability, emotional numbness, trouble sleeping or nightmares, hypervigilance, depression, anxiety, fear, symptoms of PTSD or flashbacks, low self-esteem, difficulty with sex or sexuality, hopelessness, or binary thinking, that concept of like, I have a sock on the floor, so I'm like the least clean person on the planet. And then sexually, people might be feeling fearful or damaged. They may feel confused, feeling stuck, avoid sexual activity, or feel unable to stay present in the moment. They may have flashbacks or be hypersexual to try to seek that emotional control. Or they may be traditional gender role challenges, especially if it was someone who identifies as a male who was assaulted. So recognizing indicators of assault, so potential signs of assault, and for many assaults, there's actually no signs. There's no symptoms and there's no, quote, evidence. Although physical injury does occur in about half of cases, it might include genital, extragenital, or anal injuries. Attempted strangulation, this does happen a lot. Blunt traumatic injuries to the head, face, torso, limbs, penetrating injuries to the vagina, anus, or mouth. Unexplained pelvic pain, STIs, bacterial vaginosis, pregnancy, or physical restraint, signs like arm bruising or wrist bruising, or anogenital lesions are present in 1/3 of survivors and are more likely with those with no prior sexual intercourse. So stuff to look for. Potential signs of sexual assault by age. So again, for many assaults, there's no signs, but adolescents also present with lesions on their thighs, labia minora, periurethral area, vaginal vestibule, or vagina. And women over the age of 45 are more likely to have physical injury and anogenital lesions. Elderly women are at an increased risk of vaginal tears and injury and transmission of STIs and HIV due to a thinner, more friable vaginal wall. Non-visible indicators. So chronic gynecological symptoms without clear etiology, like psychogenic vaginismus or involuntary spasm, tightening, dyspareunia during or pain during intercourse, reported pelvic pain, frequent emergency contraception requests, or delayed presentation for care. Like if somebody doesn't show up to their appointment several times, it may be a good idea to ask if something has happened. And again, sometimes there's no signs, but other behavioral cues during exams, like if they flinch, tense, or avoid eye contact. And of course, this is probably very common either way. But if somebody dissociates, if they become overcompliant, or if they have an emotional response, like they're tearful, they're irritable, or they're fearful without a clear trigger. So I want to talk about like how to inquire with that person. So we can normalize the questioning, make sure that the patient's aware that they're being asked standard questions, ensure their privacy, and if they have a guest, ask the guest to leave. We can say things like, because experiences of sexual harm are unfortunately common, I ask all my patients about this as part of their care. Or sometimes people have experiences they didn't want or didn't consent to. Has that happened to you? Many patients have had uncomfortable or harmful sexual experiences. Is there anything you'd like me to know so I can take the best care of you? I want to make sure that this is a safe and comfortable space. Have you ever been touched in a way that made you feel unsafe or unwanted? So just asking the questions and making it normal to ask. If there are clear clinical indicators, we can say something like, I'm noticing some findings that sometimes happen after non-consensual sexual contact. Would you feel comfortable sharing if anything like that happened? Or when patient comes in with symptoms like this, sometimes it's connected to a past trauma. Does that resonate for you at all? Avoid things like very blunt, were you raped, or victim blaming, did you fight back? We don't want to ask that question because that kind of translates to a why question. And as we said, 75% of sexual assault victims experience tonic immobility. Or you seem fine. Are you sure something happened? We don't want to invalidate their experience either. So if someone does disclose sexual assault to you, provide empathy, assure them that you believe them, maintain dignity for them, minimize the number of people in the room if possible. Provide referrals to victim advocacy, whatever you have in your area. And it's okay to tell somebody, I'm not really sure what your next steps are going to look like, and research together. But offer information about forensic medical exams. Here in the United States, we have a law that says that everyone is entitled to a forensic medical exam if they had experienced a sexual assault. And the typical turnaround time for that here in the United States is 5 days or 120 hours. And assure the patient that they have the ability to consent or not consent to any part of that treatment. And if they do have a sample that you potentially want to preserve, we don't want to say something to a survivor like, hey, you have to keep your clothes on, but we let them, choose. But if there are samples, it can be on a swab, and the idea for most samples is to keep it dry. So if there are sample collections that happen to happen in your office, it goes on a swab and it has to stay dry, and then it can go to the forensic medical examiner. But the best form of action would be to send them to a forensic medical examiner instead. But providing trauma-informed care to a patient. So the approach acknowledges that the survivor carries trauma not just from their sexual assault experience, but from their whole life. Like if they're a person of color, or if they're an LGBTQ plus person, they carry trauma as part of like historical trauma as well. And we're trying to avoid re-traumatization and exacerbation of trauma symptoms, make sure that we're being empathic, safe, and healing, and have that paradigm shift from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. We're trying to provide them with physical or emotional safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment through anti-oppression lens as well. And if there's complex cases, there may be like pregnancy that results from sexual assault. So 1 in 20 women in the United States, over almost 6 million, have experienced pregnancy resulting from rape or sexual coercion at some point in their lives. And sexual assault pregnancies occur at a rate about 5% per incident. So similar to that of unprotected sex or consensual sex. Hopefully we can provide non-judgmental counseling options, recognize potential for coercion from perpetrator, and recognize the potential fear of retaliation by that assailant, and assess safety before involving partners or family. So make sure that they are safe and not like release them to someone who potentially is unsafe for them. And if you have mandatory reporting law in your space, here in the United States, we have mandatory reporting laws in every state. But it's important to understand your local laws and what's supposed to happen next if they're a minor. And best practices for mandatory reporting are just to be honest with them of like, hey, I have a duty to make this known. Emphasize balancing legal options with preserving trust and minimizing trauma for the minor. Document findings in a way that are factual and non-judgmental. So if we said the word rape versus the word potentially sexual assault, like those things are different. And work with your local agencies and supports when you can. So a forensic medical exam, in case you are unfamiliar, it is for medical care and treatment. It's to gather physical history. They don't, quote, collect evidence, they collect specimens, but it's for investigation and prosecution, and they do a warm handoff to other resources. But the purpose of a forensic medical exam is not to decide if a sexual assault occurred or not to determine if a patient is lying. It's not just to test for STIs, although they do sometimes include that as well. And once again, it's 120 hours here in the US or 5 days approximately. Specimen collection will generally yield more accurate results when it's completed ASAP. So if it's right after the assault, that's better. Also, STI prophylaxis, including HIV and PEP, has to be provided within 72 hours of the assault. And for forensic medical exam preparation, if it's possible, we ask that the survivor leave on those clothings, or they can put them in a paper bag, but not in a plastic bag because we want to preserve specimens. We want to make sure they dry out, not rot or mold. It is best if they avoid showering, eating, or drinking. However, if they need to do those things, they need to do those things. This is trauma-informed care. We're taking care of the patient. So what happens during an exam? The forensic nurse will ask about general medical history. They'll ask what happened before, during, and after, and the survivor is allowed to answer all, some, or none of the questions. They do a head-to-toe physical exam. They do a pelvic exam as well. They take photos, they take swabs, and they collect trace specimen. After that, they'll do a urine collection, a pregnancy test. They'll do emergency contraception if the person needs it, STI prophylaxis, or NPEP and NPEP as well. And they sometimes refer out for that too. And again, the survivor can consent to all, some, or none of the medical exam. It usually takes about 3 hours. It can take longer, especially if the person had a lot of specimens. And it's possible that no evidence or specimens will be found, and genital injury does not always occur for every sexual assault. So it's important to know where to send a patient in your area. And if you don't know, make sure that you do find this out. If they are assaulted, where do you send them? So this is a patient resource. This is 10 tips for going to the OB/GYN as a trauma survivor. So in case you're interested, I really enjoyed some of the video comments on that. Here, I'll put this here for a second if you need it. After my last pelvic exam, when the doctor left the room so I could get dressed, somehow I ended up on the floor, sobbing, hyperventilating, scratching my arms to the point where I was drawing blood. I don't remember how I ended up on the floor. I do know that my doctor was extremely compassionate and caring. She wanted me to be safe, so I wouldn't leave the exam room so I could make eye contact and speak. And then other video comments. Thank you for making this and bringing awareness to OB/GYN. Going to the OB/GYN isn't easy as a survivor. A lot of my friends and family think it's no big deal, but it can be so triggering. So access to this slide deck, y'all can have it if you want. My email is carrie@acesdb.org. If you have questions, please let me know. And then if you have time, please do fill out an evaluation for me. This helps me out to know how things went. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat as well. But if you have questions, I'm here for them. Or you can please reach out to me at carrie@acesdb.org.